So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to my talk. It's nice to see so many people, even though it's such an early slot. I hope you all slept well and are ready for another day of NDC Oslo. So my talk is called 82 bugs I collected in a year you won't believe made it to production. But actually, before I start my talk, I have to make an admission to you. Actually, I'm sorry to tell you, but the title is a lie. Actually, I didn't collect 82 bugs. I collected 279 bugs. Yeah, so you're getting more value out of this talk. I'm really sorry. I hope you're not mad at me for that. It's actually also kind of more like 2 years and not, 1 year, but I'll get into that into a bit more detail a bit later. And also thank you so much for NDC Oslo for organizing this conference. I think that deserves an applause from us. All right, so first let me introduce myself. My name is François Martin. I'm a senior software full stack engineer that works at Karakun. I live in Switzerland and also their offices are in Switzerland. And we develop software for customers and also we do consulting. And I'm also an active member of the Swiss Testing Board, which drives forward certifications in software testing. So I'm actually a bug collector, as you might have noticed. Well, not these kinds of bugs, actually. They are these kinds of bugs, as you can see here, for example. This is something with my name that happens quite a lot, as you can imagine. Encoding is something a lot of companies don't get right still. For example, this one is another way that this shows. Or you can see there are tons of cases, or like errors like these or servers being stubborn, whatever that means, right? And then I'm also seeing pages like this, where obviously, it wasn't ready for prime time yet, but I don't know, somehow it made it to production. And then there are cases like this, where it says, this name can only contain alphanumeric characters. Well, I only see alphanumeric characters there. I don't see the issue. Yeah. And then the domain is still available, get it today, but it's not available. Yeah, no idea. And then there are cases like this where you want to select something, but it only says object in each of the cases. And then boarding pass not recognized, null. Great, right? What do I do now? Or like null's phone was enrolled. Also another great one. Or here, more not a number and undefined SDI meets. And then, you want to check your emails and then suddenly you have, empty emails or no emails. I don't know what I need to do with that. And then there are also cases where you chat with an AI and then it tells you like weird things like underscore bar, underscore request, underscore findings, and you don't really know what to do with it. And there are like cases where the night or the dark mode doesn't work properly and like the text from the light mode still applies. Yeah, this is something I've encountered too. Or like the classic. Yeah, it seems like we still can't do math, it seems. All right, and then another one I recently encountered was, to whom of you is this familiar, user interface like this? I think, yeah, most of you, yeah, right. So, you can customize your burger when you're ordering something out, and you can add or, subtract things. Here you can see the subtract buttons are all grayed out, so I cannot press them. But let's see what happens now if I press this plus button here. And then we see, as soon as I press the plus button, it goes to 2, which is good. That's expected, right? You may have noticed there's a slight layout shift. So you may notice if I go back and forwards, it shifts to a little bit down. This isn't something that, is just because of my slide that happened on the page itself. This is also, like, I would say, maybe a minor bug you could consider. At least it's not something that's nice in terms of user experience. But this is not what this bug is about. So let's press the plus button on the cheese again. 0? What? Okay, so let's press it again. Let's see what happens. Okay, yeah, that's weird. I'm kind of curious how they will give me this 0.0000 whatever 4 slice of cheese on my burger. Yeah. All right, so yeah. So let me first start off with some disclaimers. So on the one hand, it's not about bashing any companies. So I tried to anonymize the bugs as much as I could. But of course, I'm aware that you could, for example, de-anonymize certain things if you really want to, or if you know the product, then you could just as well, guess what it is. But this is not the purpose of the talk. The purpose of the talk is to learn something from them. And also, I have to tell you, I found bugs from the smallest startups to the biggest companies. So it doesn't really matter, is what I noticed, if your company is small or big. So it doesn't matter what product it is. And also, when I'm talking about UI bugs, what I mean by that is, I mean bugs that are likely due to code that was written in the front end, where the bug is coming from. And also the platforms that I mainly use are Android and Mac OS. I also do use iPad OS and Windows though. So, there are some, but most of the bugs will be some I found on Android and on Mac OS. So just to keep this in mind. And also most of the bugs I found myself, but there were like a handful that I got sent by other people, just when I was in a conversation with them and they told me about some bug, and then I was like, you need to send me this. I'm really curious about this. And of course, as soon as I started collecting bugs, people have been coming up to me and telling me like, oh, I found this bug, it might be interesting for you. So I think before we start, the question is, what is a bug? So maybe some of you know the word defect. This is actually the official like ISTQB terminology for what we refer to as bug commonly. And here you can see that's the definition that you see here. It's like that it's something that impairs its intended use of a product when it does not meet its requirements or specifications. And this is kind of what I'm focusing about in this talk, especially the part where it says impairs its intended use. I mean, usually, since those bugs that I found aren't in products that I worked on, they are usually bugs that I just found that impair my use of them, of the websites. I don't know the requirements and the specifications, obviously, of the website, so I kind of have to rely on that part. So to get into my rules, I only count unique bugs. So if I encounter a bug and then like half a year later, I don't count it as another bug again. I only count bugs when there are errors if they either expose information that they shouldn't, because that's not something you should do, right? Or maybe they provide no instructions on what to do. Like you can see here, error while loading consignments. But what does that mean? What should I do now to fix it? And maybe there are instructions, but if you follow them, they don't work. As you can see in this example here, it says, talk to support. And once I click on talk to support, it redirects to the same page and says, talk to support again with the button. So yeah, this doesn't really help me out. And also the reproducibility doesn't matter. If it happens once, it counts. I would have to spend a lot more time than it was already in terms of the work to categorize all of those many bugs if I would try to reproduce all of them and so on. So, and I think in general, I was thinking it doesn't really matter if a bug is reproducible or not. If a bug made it to production, even if it's not reproducible, it is something you should fix, and this is what this talk is about. And also, as I mentioned just earlier, I don't count any bugs from webs or websites I contributed to, whether this is to avoid bias or, yeah, exactly. I mean, whether this is to avoid bias or like just to, because I put a ton of bugs in my apps, I'll leave it up to you for this side. All right, so let's have a look at some statistics. So you can see here, these are the bugs that I collected, and this is where a bit more than, around 2 years comes from. So I actually only really seriously started collecting bugs in the start of 2024. So you can see that's why until 2024, there weren't that many that I found. You can see it kind of went a lot higher. And I can tell you, in fact, that I found 124 bugs in 2024 alone. So, it's still more than in the title that was specified. And like before 2024, I just collected the bugs that I found interesting or, weird. Yeah. And you can see that also there seems to be like a trend. It seems to be almost consistently above like 5 bugs that I found per month. And you can see there has been like a spike at around like, this year around March or April. This was like the season where I was booking my travels for all of the conferences. Yeah, and a lot of the websites that I booked on had bugs, so this was the reason for them, being so high in this moment. So, yeah, but you can see there are quite a lot of bugs, and I was kind of surprised how many bugs there were actually, in fact. So, and then let's see. I'm kind of curious. What do you think was the most common kind of bug I found? Any ideas from the audience? Yeah. Null references. Okay. Yeah. Other ideas? I know it's a bit early, but maybe one or two more ideas. Images of information. Okay, good. Another idea? Input validation. That's a good one. Yeah. Other ideas? Okay, I'll reveal it. So you can see on the one hand, I categorize them by type. So there's like more like a major category if you want. So you can see the bugs on the UI were the most. I mean, obviously, on the one hand, this makes sense because I can't validate responses on the backend, for of course, for sure. But if the UI interprets it in some way, then that makes sense. But there are some bugs that I also found in terms of like error handling, just was suggested by someone, or like logic bugs. Logic bugs are the ones that I'm pretty sure that they come from the backend, or I was able to verify it myself. So, and then if you look at this bug, for example, I was chatting with an AI, and then I was troubleshooting like an issue that was very difficult to troubleshoot, where it was about the layout shift actually that happened in a website that I was designing. And then I said, it's better, but there's still a layout shift. And this was the response I've got. It says, it looks like we've pasted a bunch of content about Juggernaut, Astronaut, Astro Toilet. What? I didn't do that. Yeah, so you can see these are kind of the bugs that were AI related. If we look at these bugs here, there weren't too many of them, but they were kind of funny, at least the ones that I found. And then I categorized them also into bug subtypes, as you can see here. And you can see the most common bugs were responsiveness. This actually genuinely surprised me. I didn't expect to see so many bugs in the responsiveness area. And the next one was glitching. And I've given this talk already a few times this year, and the previous time I've given it, the glitching was a lot lower. This kind of rose just recently. I don't know why, but and then there's unresolved templating, which is the next one. Unfiltered error message. So, the unfiltered error message was definitely a good one. Or like layout conflicts. Layout conflicts are kind of similar to responsiveness, what I consider, but it's more like cases where even if you have different sizes of the screen, it would always be like the case that it would be wrong. Responsiveness is like if it's just depending on the resolution, there are issues. Yeah, and you can see a lot of other kinds of things, but I think it's kind of curious to see how responsiveness is, by far the biggest one yet. And still maybe like honorable mention, the calculation is something with 10 bugs, which still surprised me. I kind of thought that we had the testing figured out on the backend already. It also didn't surprise me about the many UI bugs because on the front end you tend to not test as much as on the backend. So this is something where I definitely wasn't surprised to see that, but the calculation kind of surprised me. Then there are also bugs like this, as you can see here. And you might be thinking, well, this is just probably due to the underscore. At least that was my thinking when I saw this bug initially. But I can tell you, I tried it without the underscore. I tried it with @username, just like it was provided here. And it didn't work. I wasn't able to proceed. So this kind of shows me, or maybe it should show you too, that it isn't only maybe about the count of bugs, but it's also about how bad they are, because maybe they are bugs that are blocking you from continuing to finish a form, for example. And that's where severity comes in. So if you're not familiar with this concept, it's like you define what kind of severity a bug has to say how bad it is. And usually it makes sense to make like a flowchart, for example, for it, as you can see here. This is just an example of what I've done from my experience. And by the way, if you don't have something like this, there's a QR code on the top right. You can scan it. And if you enter your email address, I will send you an email where you will get the slides. And then you can get the slides too. You can feel free to either take this verbatim to use in your project if you don't have something like that. It definitely makes sense to have something like that because then you can have a measure on the bugs, what severity they are. And it's also not something where, in projects where you don't have this, usually it's like just everyone guesses what kind of severity it has, and then it's different depending on the person that does it. And this makes it a bit more consistent. And what I'm focusing on in this talk are mostly like I'm differentiating between bugs that are blockers or bugs that are critical, and then I'm not differentiating because between the other ones because I feel like they are not as relevant. I feel like for us to know, it's mostly interesting how many blocker and critical bugs made it through production. So yeah, if you have a look at how many bugs there are that are critical and blocker, just together, then we have a look here. We can see that data validation is at the top. So this kind of changes the order. You can see responsiveness, or like the UI bugs are at the bottom. So even though there were the most bugs that are found in the UI, the most critical ones were actually the ones that were, in data validation, error handling, data, and so on. And also, if you look at the subtypes, it's similar. Blocked without resolution here just means that I was at the stage where in the error handling I couldn't continue, just like you've seen with the screenshot where it said, oh, you talk to support if you click on it, and then you're back in the same page again. So let's get into responsiveness, since this was the one that had the most. So you can see an example here. Who of you does this seem familiar to? Interestingly, not that many people, but I'm not sure if maybe it's too early to raise your hand. That's fine. But yeah, you can see here, maybe if you have this bug, it's about having the button more models, and if I click on it, then you can see that the rest is cut off, essentially. And if I have a look, I can see there's like something that hints at there being a menu that opens up, but it's to the left and you can't see it, which makes it a bug that is about responsiveness. And so one way that you can fix this is by having mobile-first design in place. Who of you knew about this mantra yet? All right, that's quite a lot of you. And who of you uses that mantra at work? Okay, there are fewer, yeah. This kind of talk should maybe show you, since there are so many bugs in the responsiveness area, maybe you should try to incorporate that more. Because to those of you that don't know what mobile-first design is, by the way, it's about you design your website when you are in a browser where you set the size of your browser to be small. You can in Chrome, for example, or Firefox, there's a similar feature as well, where you can, in the developer tools, just click on a button and then you can shrink down your viewport, make it smaller depending on the device you want to emulate. And the idea is you develop your application with the mobile device first. And then once you got that design down, you do the design for the application that is in the full desktop size. And the idea behind that is that usually if you have a design that is working on a smaller screen, it usually also works on a bigger screen. It's maybe not as nice to use as a design that was optimized for desktop, but it's usually a better starting point than going with a desktop and then shrinking it down. And then another one is end-to-end testing on mobile devices. Who of you does that? Okay, a few people, 3, 4, yeah. So that's great already, the ones that are doing this, but that's something I don't see commonly being done, and I think it should be done more. And there are 2 frameworks I could recommend there. One of them is called WebDriver.io. It's a framework which allows you to do the testing on real devices as well in the cloud if you want. And this is a really nice feature about it. There's Playwright, which is a pretty good tool. The only disadvantage is that it only offers emulation for mobile testing. But of course, if you are already using Playwright in your application, then definitely use that. And it's still better than nothing to have emulation. But if you don't have yet a website that is end-to-end tested with some framework, then maybe consider using WebDriver.io if you want to make sure that it works well on mobile. Of course, it depends on if your application is used a lot on mobile or not. Their analytics usually help if you have them. But one issue that you commonly have with end-to-end testing is, who of you has experienced this case before where you have a test that ran, for example, on CI, and what usually happens is it fails and then you just rerun the build and then it passes again? Who of you experienced that? Okay, so that's most of you again, yeah. So these are called flaky tests, for those of you who never heard this term. And actually, again, if you scan this QR code, you will also get an ebook from me, which is all about fixing those flaky tests forever. Because I noticed this at so many different companies, I decided to write an ebook about it. And you can get it for free if you scan that, so you can get rid of these issues. All right, so let's get into glitching, our next bug. So you can see glitching for me is kind of like cases where it's difficult to say where the issue comes from. You know, it's like something strange happened and it's not really reproducible. These are the cases where I mostly try to see if it's somewhat reproducible, just because I wanted to make sure what kind of bug it was. But this is just one of the cases where it's totally unstyled, which is on the one hand the bug, but also there's like stuff like JSON things that are embedded inside, which I have no idea why it comes up like this. And this is another case. So you can see suddenly on my iPad it said like iPad and then some weird Thai characters. And this actually means this device, by the way, is what I was able to figure out, at least what machine translation told me. If you know Thai and the machine translation is garbage, please tell me afterwards. And this is actually one of the most hilarious bugs I've found so far. So you can see I wrote a text and then I said, due to a genuine bug, and then comma but, and then it suggests me to correct it by saying, instead of what it claims to be bug, to write like bug space bug. Kind of weird. Bug, yeah. No idea how it came about that, but this is also another case of glitching that we can see. And what helps here again is end-to-end testing just in general. But of course, this isn't the silver bullet, because those errors happen usually very rarely or sporadically. What I really recommend here is dog fooding. Who of you knows what dog fooding is? Okay, that's a few of you. So dog fooding is essentially a practice where the idea comes kind of from eating your own dog food in a way that if you are at a company, develop a software, then usually you should be also using it internally. Like for example, in this case where we have a grammar checking tool, then you want to maybe use it internally as well. Maybe you could incentivize people internally to use it or just have it pre-installed so that it's easier for people to do so. And then the people will just use it, and then they will find bugs like this and just incentivize them to report the bugs as well, make it easy for them. And also definitely make sure something that gets forgotten a lot is to, when you have bug reports that you get, also make sure to give them feedback and tell them like, oh, it's fixed now or things like this. Even though I know it's a lot of work, but this will make sure that you have a culture of where in your company people will submit more bugs. Yeah, and I'm curious, just among the people that were saying they knew it, how many of you use it at work? Okay, there are a few of you. Okay, that's great, nice. So and then there's another one, which is exploratory testing. Exploratory testing is kind of a practice where you perform tests which are performed by experts using the app itself in a hands-on way, and you're both designing and executing the test cases at the same time. And also, you're doing just on the fly while you're, navigating through the application. And also, you're using your intuition and your experience to just identify defects. And usually, they find quite a lot of defects that were missed with some scripted tests. So this is a very effective method I don't see employed a lot. I mean, who of you does exploratory tests at work? Okay, there are more than I thought. Cool, nice. I mean, I would say like 5 to 10 people. And then another way of finding glitches is by actually heat map visualization. So if you knew about this technique, right, already also kind of 10, 20 people maybe. So this is where you kind of measure how long a user stays with the cursor in which parts of the screen, and also where they click. And you can see it generates like a nice heat map like this. So you can see here, for example, you have a form, and then you can see, on the one hand, there are some people that press on the left and some press on the right. So this also helps you understand, on the one hand, a bit better how your customers are using the software. So this helps you also when you are designing test cases to see, like, maybe it would make sense to test, like, does the form behave the same way if I click on the text field on the left or on the right? And this is something that you can do with that. And also, another advantage of having this kind of visualization is that you can do something which is like detecting so-called dead clicks. So for example, you could measure if you click on something, usually you expect something to happen, and if nothing happens, then usually that could be a case where there could be a bug. Especially if a lot of people do that, and this could be a case where you could sound an alarm, for example, if something like that happens. And there's also something that is called rage clicks. So here it's kind of, you probably had this issue before where you just like, something didn't work and out of frustration you just clicked multiple times, just hoping it would work again. Yeah, just like with flaky tests, or you try to run it multiple times and see if it passes again. And these kind of usually indicate points of friction, and they're usually most frameworks that can do this kind of heat mapping for you. They usually also have like a detection for that built in, so they already detect if you click multiple times, and then you can see that. And this way you can see some of the glitches that are happening, how you so that you could find them. And just to show you an example, here we have a case where we have like another AI chatbot, and then here, if I click on the, here it says like Claude 3.5 Sonnet. When I click on this, then it brings up usually a menu where it shows you different models to choose from. And by the way, there will be like a little bit of flickering, so if you're sensitive to flashing lights, please look away. I'll let you know again when flashing lights are over. So you can see what happens when I click on it. You can see it opens a context menu and it closes again all the time. So this would be like a bug that you could discover this way, because you would repeatedly clicking on it, hoping that maybe eventually it will work. And then this would be a way to fix those kinds of issues. And an open source tool I can recommend for that is PostHog. There aren't that many open source tools for that. This is a really nice one. It is free to use, and also you can it's free to use with a very generous like free tier. There's like a paid version as well, but you can also self-host it yourself and get everything for free. So yeah. Then let's have a look at unresolved templating. So whom of you does that look familiar to? Okay, well, it's quite a few of you, like 20 people, I would say. So yeah, this is like cases like these where you maybe had a hard-coded string somewhere that should have been like changed into another string, like writing a proper not available, bugs like this, or like bugs like this. And you can see here, this was actually on a hotel that I wanted to book initially. You can say it says, would like to remind you that the reception is open xnum x out of xnum x every day. Yeah, this is perfect. I have to tell you, this was actually the reason that I didn't book this hotel, because I was kind of dependent on having a hotel that had 24-hour check-in, because my flight arrived quite late. And this kind of shows that bugs like these that seem mundane in a way, or that a lot of companies I worked at would think to be like minor maybe, or something like that, it could actually be major, or like blocker as in these cases, because actually they lost a customer. They didn't get my booking because essentially I was not able to read this. So this is something to also keep in mind when looking at these bugs. And then there's another one. This is just in an email, and here it's just something that may not look as professional if you have an email that you get sent and then it has like the placeholder instead of your first name there. So yeah, make sure to also make sure you don't do these. And one of them is you can do on unit and integration testing. One thing I rarely see done, but I really recommend you to do as well if you don't have this yet, is to test like your email templates or like just template replacements in general. One nice thing you can do is you can, of course, test it very thoroughly. But if you don't have those tests at work, what I recommend you to do is you should at least have a test where you, for example, run through all of the different options that you have in your templating, and then just see if you can find any of the placeholders still in the code that results from running the templating. And then this way you can quite easily find out if you have, for example, some strings that you were missing, for example, in your file that you replace. And this is a very easy way to essentially figure out in a good way if you can find any bugs. And also you should make sure to test some edge cases. So make sure you test also cases where you have no value, as you can see in this case with the placeholder f name, or like a very long value, because this often breaks the layout as well. Or like when you have UTF-8 characters, my name will thank you. And then there's unfiltered error message, which was another very common bug we have found. And here it's, for example, cannot read properties of undefined reading toString. It's fine to have an error like this, but you shouldn't like log it on the front end or show it to the user. Maybe it's fine if you are like on a development environment, but you shouldn't do this on production. So, and this is another one, like a client-side exception happened, and you can check the browser console. This bug is especially helpful if you are on a mobile phone, where it's almost impossible to open the browser console, of course. Yeah, so it can also have an impact on security, as you can see here on the right. So who of you has seen an error like this in production? Yeah, almost every one of you. I'm not surprised about that at all. Yeah, so here in this case, you can see we actually expose information. And this was actually one that I redacted some information from just to not expose any information that could be troublesome, of course. And you can see here we notice, for example, this is a .NET application just by looking at this error message. And then we can see that there is a path on the machine, which is C, users, workbox, source, and so on. And by this, we already can deduce what paths there are. And this is something you could use for some further attacks in security. So this is another reason why you shouldn't do this, or make sure that you prevent these kinds of bugs. So and it can also be a usability issue, as you can see here. So I don't know about you. I mean, I know regexes, but you know, when I'm casually browsing the internet and want to buy something in an online store, I don't want to worry about figuring out like what does this regex mean now here. Yeah, so I definitely make sure you don't show like regexes like this. Make it a user-readable message. And also, you should make sure to turn off your stack traces in production. You know, also test for that. You know, as you can see, there have been a lot of cases where we thought we turned them off, but then when we tried it out, we figured, oh, you know, it turns out it actually didn't work as we intended it to be. So make sure to test that. And also, in production in general, what I recommend you to do is only return errors that are explicitly returned from the backend. So make sure that you have an explicit error type that you define, where you then return, you know, you then show it in the front end, what is returned from the backend, for example. Or otherwise, if you have any other error that you didn't handle yet, just show a generic error message. An unexpected error occurred, for example, please try again later or contact if this issue persists. And here I also really recommend you to, if you can, provide like an email address or something, because it happened to me more times than I would like to admit that there were cases just like the one you have seen with this, you know, contact support button, and then you click it again, and then, you know, the page doesn't work. You know, if the page has some issues, then there's a good chance that maybe your form will also not work. So keep this in mind, and if you put like an email address there that people can contact, you know, ideally even in another project, we had a case where we added like a special mail to link, which when you clicked it would automatically open up your email client with pre-filled the subject and with the text that had like the, you know, like some information like a unique ID in it, which we could use to then trace the error on the backend. And this was making it very easy for us to actually troubleshoot these issues. And people were reporting the bugs much more because it was so easy to do. It was just one click on the email, and then, you know, it already, you know, you just had to click send essentially, and then you were already done. And also make sure you add alerting for errors that you get from the front end and the back end. Especially the front end part is something I don't see many people do. Like, I mean, how many people of you, or who of you does send the front end errors to the back end for centralized logging? Okay, so I see like 4 or 5 hands. That's great. So all of the others, I would really encourage you, if you have a front end in your application, make sure you relay those errors also to the back end to then put this into like a centralized logging system. And this way, you can really proactively find errors very quickly. And then there's also unfiltered debug information, which is kind of similar to the unfiltered error messages. But here you can see, for example, at least I hope that's error, that's like a debug message, but you can see it exposes the SQL statement that is actually running on the database. So here you can see, of course, this is not good for security reasons, and you should definitely make sure to avoid this. So on one hand, I mean, I think it should be probably obvious to you, but make sure you turn off debug flags in production, or if you must, make sure you just use some feature flags for specific users. Don't just think, oh, you know, I'll quickly turn it on and almost nobody will visit the page anyways, right? And then turn it off again. And of course, make sure you prevent SQL injection or like cross-site scripting in your application to make sure that even if you had a case like this where it would occur, then you wouldn't have any issues from people being able to abuse this. And there's also string formatting. So you can see on the right, there's an example of where I was searching for my space way. And then once I clicked on a song, then it showed me playing from search my plus way in search. So essentially here we had a case where probably this was encoded to be put into be sent to the backend, maybe in a query parameter or something like that. And this was probably the reason for this, I'm guessing. And then they, for some reason, took then this to show it in the case of the song. So you should make sure, of course, that it shows you the same search term that you used and not these pluses and so on. And then there's another one where it's like if you have, for example, number of guests and then it says 2 guests. So this I noticed happens very frequently, especially with internationalization. But in this case, for example, this was a bug which I found in a case where it wasn't about internationalization. Else I have like a separate category for that. But make sure that you really pay attention that you have all of those edge cases covered. And again, unit and integration testing is something you can use there. Or also there is something called parameterized testing or data-driven testing. Who of you knows that already? All right, so I see not too many hands up. So it's actually where you have a way that you can specify in your test, for example, one line where you say what kind of parameters you want. And then the test will simply be run line by line that you have in your test. And this makes it very easy to just add new test cases and add multiple test cases in a way that is really readable. And this is something I really recommend you to do. If you're using Java, then there's a link behind the data-driven testing link here. By the way, if you get the slides, you can just click on those links and then you can find out more information about those things that I mentioned here. But I'm pretty sure there are similar things in your framework as well that you're using or in your programming language. And also, if you are using internationalization, then be careful if you have different languages, because it may not be always the same. Like, for example, we say 2 guests, and then we say 1 guest, but also we say 0 guests, for example, right, in English. But this might not always be the same in other languages, and keep this in mind. It may be different. Don't just assume that because it's this way in your language that it will be the same in every other language as well. Make sure you're really mindful of that when testing this. And also, again, test edge cases to make sure this doesn't happen. All right, then we have here the case where we see text keys. So here, by the way, I counted the cases where it was that at least I was seeing this issue long enough that I was able to take a screenshot. I'm aware there are some cases where it shows you the text keys and then suddenly it reappears. But yeah, you can see here, this is a case where you just see the text keys, but it's not really helpful. I mean, at least being a developer, I kind of know, okay, this is probably that, the pairing is completed. You can kind of guess that, but as a normal user, you may be kind of confused what happened or think like something went wrong. And it's another case, I mean, especially in this case, it kind of exposes that they are using JSP, which is a way of writing like front ends with Java. But yeah, this kind of also exposes information which is not nice. But just in general, this is not a nice thing to do. And it can also be a blocking bug, actually. As you can see here on the bottom right, this was a page where it was on a website where you could purchase classes. And here you see it says blue light filter disclaimer as a text key. And this can be something where the lawyers can really then be a problem, because if, for example, since this is a disclaimer, you put it here for legal reasons. If the customer claims they didn't read it because they didn't see it, which in this case was the case, you could get into legal trouble if you happen to have an issue with that. So this could also kind of shows how a bug that seems kind of mundane, like text keys, can turn into a real issue in some cases. And again, here, unit integration testing, where you make sure that if you do the replacement, that it correctly replaces everything. Here again, you can use the same technique as with the email templates, just then apply it in a way that you take the different strings and then you see if you can replace them and find still some placeholders in the final translated strings. And there are some libraries like i18next that can actually log a warning when a text key is not translated, and you can find out how to do that in this link. And then it's also very effective in combination if you have component tests on the front end. And there's like a plugin that I really recommend you, which is under the fails on console warnings thing. It can make it so that when you run a test on the front end, it will actually fail the test, in this case, if there is a warning that was logged. And this allows you, if you have very good coverage over your components in the front end, to find cases really quickly where you have an untranslated text key, which is really useful. But of course, this requires good test coverage. But even if you're setting this up now and you don't have a lot of text coverage, if you just start up now and suddenly just with time build up this test coverage, it will be better than nothing. And then also something I mentioned a bit earlier is about like when you have text keys that are just flashing for a brief moment. I mean, who of you has experienced this? Probably most of you, I'm guessing. Yeah, not that many people, surprisingly. But here, one way that you can fix this is to use something called server-side rendering, where you essentially already from the backend return the full page with the full HTML and don't only return, for example, the index, the HTML file with some JavaScript that then on the client gets rendered. And this way, you can already bake in essentially the translations. For example, when you're requesting the website, you can already pass in a parameter with the user's language, and then you can already translate it, when it was server-side rendered, and this makes sure that the keys are never shown to the user. And also, if you have to asynchronously load the text keys from a file, from a server somewhere, for example, then I would really recommend you to show something which is called like a skeleton screen. They are those kind of things, as you can see here on the bottom, where you have like a gray thing placeholder that shows, while the page is still loading. Definitely make sure to show that, and then it's also nicer for the user because they see like, oh, the page is still loading. Then there's another one where we have the issue that we have incorrect or missing information, which can be a particularly, I would say, dangerous bug, especially in this case. You can see if you look closely here, we have a case where essentially we have a exchange rate of 0.0058. And you can see either we had like some economic recession in Japan, or I don't know what happened there. Probably not. So yeah, this seems very unlikely that the exchange rate went from 0.6 to such a low number in one day. So for sure, it looks to me like there was just like a comma error, given that it's so close to the other value. Yeah, so this is another case. This is like a CPU cooler I wanted to buy. I didn't buy it for this price, of course. Yeah, you can see like 24,000 is a bit a lot. You can see even in the bottom it says like buy verified returns from 95. So yeah, this usually costs like around 100. So 24,000 is excessive for that. So yeah, that's definitely something you should make sure to prevent. Here it really makes sense that you employ some 4 eyes principle when you are entering the data. And here it makes sense that if you have another person that's looking over the different things that you enter, if the data is entered manually, and if you have the possibility, then please add some validations also to make sure that to check if the data is significantly different from the previous, for example, as in the case of the price that you can see here, or in the exchange rates that we've seen earlier. And this can really save you from having those kinds of issues. And what also makes sense is if you're fetching data from an API, then it makes sense, especially if you're in finance or some other critical application, then make sure you add some plausibility checks. So for example, you can check, did the price go up by a significant amount? And if yes, you can then, for example, show an alert or just raise an alert to the people that are developing the software or like maintaining the software, depending on who that is in your organization. Or also, I would make sure to then show a notice or like show an error message on the front end. This depends, of course. For example, if you have an application where you must only show like the most up-to-date data, then it makes sense, of course, to show like an error and tell the user, oh, this didn't work. Please try again later. Or if you can tolerate having some older data, you maybe could show just the data that you had before in those cases, and then maybe show like a warning on top of it and say, maybe pay attention, this data could be outdated. Maybe check back again later for up-to-date data or something like that. So yeah, there was also actually a case that I experienced where I was fetching data from an API, and it was about wind data. I was just using for my smart home that I have at home. And then suddenly at some point, it showed like a wind of like 99,999 kilometers per hour. Yeah, that would be kind of a strong wind if that was possible. Yeah, but these are cases that could happen. APIs often, in some cases they can just return data that for some reason made it into it that was wrong, and yeah, be mindful of that, of course. So again, here is the QR code that you have if you want to get either the slides or the ebook, and also I'm available now for questions. Thank you so much for being here.